Great. Well, thank you, Julia and Alan, for getting us started. So I'm going to share a bit more about an overview to orientate us on what it is we'll be covering in the next 3 days and provide some important practical considerations to think about as we enter the climate analysis and adaptation space. I want to acknowledge Lorna Cates. She can't be here today, but her thinking underlies all of what I'm about to share, and I'm going to do my best to pass along her wisdom and the collective wisdom from WUCA. This practical advice is based on experiences passed along so that we can build a stronger adaptation community where information and exchange and cooperation is critical. And there's really no reason to reinvent the wheel. And there are many solutions and lessons learned already available. And hopefully this workshop is an opportunity to inspire you all to learn and help to build on each other's efforts. Next slide. So when it comes to climate change adaptation, we have a conundrum. We're limited in our resources. We can't prepare for everything. We also can't afford to prepare for the worst case. So the redundancies of the systems required to address the worst of what could happen really just isn't feasible. Yet we also can't afford to be unprepared. So no one wants to be unprepared when it comes to disasters striking. People's lives and livelihoods are at stake. So how do we approach this challenge? Next slide. So WUCA members, after struggling with this conundrum, have outlined 4 steps to get started. So the first, understand, so climate science and model projection capabilities and limitations. So understanding that is a first step. So what does climate change mean to you and your system? What are the limitations within your system? And what are the limits of the current science? And what can that tell us can be really foundational to any type of preparedness. Then step 2, assess and figure out your water system's vulnerabilities to potential changes, and then use those assessments to move into making plans, which incorporate climate uncertainty in your planning process. And then move into implement. So to take action to implement adaptation strategies. This could be supply investments, water quality investments, or any number of other things that are needed to build adaptation capacity. Also, importantly, I think recognizing that we're in this ever-evolving landscape and you'll need to be flexible and adaptable as we go forward. So these 4 steps really underlie a foundation for WUCA's leading practices. So next slide. So the leading practices are an effort that was led by WUCA to promote climate resilient water utilities and thriving communities. So living out the mission of WUCA to collaboratively advance water utility climate change adaptation. This collection of practices covers a suite of climate adaptation actions and really is intended to promote collaborative learning. So the collection is currently 39 practices, which are each supported by concrete examples that reflect a range of different climate adaptations. Today, we'll give you a flavor of what these are, but would encourage you to go online to learn more. And I think Alyssa just posted in the chat the place you can go to explore the leading practices more. So as background, these leading practices came to be through a series of conversations where WUCA members discussed what climate change adaptation required and quickly realized that it was much more than understanding climate impacts or planning for them. I mean, those are certainly critical, but there's more. It includes engaging, so motivating and supporting others, creating effective climate messages, sustaining, so finding ways to monitor conditions, develop funding, maintain capacity, and manage expectations, and also importantly, to act to implement changes in one's assets and actions. So these are the 5 key climate adaptation action areas that also serve as a useful organizing framework for what we'll be talking about throughout this workshop. It's important to note that these action areas aren't meant to go in a particular order, but really encourage people to focus on what resonates most with them according to where they're at, and then use the actions to think about also opportunities of where do you want to go. Next slide. So before you do any assessment, before really jumping in, you want to ask some questions that are highlighted here. So what's your end game? What type of information can you use, and what type of decisions do you want to inform? You want to make sure that you're not just generating data for the sake of generating data, and be sure that you end up with something that's actionable and can truly inform a decision. This is critical in helping to decide the method, and whether it's simple or whether it's more sophisticated, and can really help guide what data it is that you need. Do you need more granular data, and also to help to navigate to what is available and what should be used. So quickly, as an example, whether your question could be something to get a better sense of future temperatures at the end of the century on the East Coast, or maybe the information that you really need is something to do with summertime stream flows in a small watershed in the 2030s, or something entirely different. So thinking through at the beginning to help you decide what tools are needed and are most appropriate can help in making sure that your analysis goes in the direction you want it to go, and thinking about how you want to engage this ever-evolving science. As we learn more, and as emission levels change, the science does continue to evolve, which is generally a good thing. We're learning more, but importantly, not waiting for the latest and greatest global climate model projection before you start your planning and implementation is important. And then too, importantly, before jumping, to help think through how you want to go about sharing the learning. Think about your audience, your messages, both internally within your organization, and then also certainly externally with your stakeholders and the public. Next slide. So without thinking through these questions, there's certainly running the risk of entering kind of an endless loop where you become paralyzed by there being too much data or too much additional analysis, and it becomes really hard to take action. So the goal here is to give you all the tools to avoid this analysis paralysis. Next slide. So here are a set of guiding principles to help focus on how to think about using climate information. So the first principle, it's important to evaluate climate risk. So evidence is overwhelming that climate change is here and now, and it would be irresponsible not to consider it in your planning. Again, lives and livelihoods are at stake. Also, it's important to start. Evaluations of climate change need to start somewhere and can be refined and become more comprehensive over time. The second guiding principle is models can be useful tools when used appropriately. They can help us think through things more systematically and do experiments to think more deeply about the systems and how they're connected, but they also have limitations. And importantly, model output is not intended to be a prediction, but instead you should treat it as something of a possible future, a scenario that can complement existing monitoring and evaluation systems. And then the third guiding principle is uncertainty is everyone's responsibility, both water managers and scientists. So scientists who study climate impacts continuously strive to place results in context, and quantify the uncertainty in ways that are relevant and hopefully informed by water managers' needs. At the same time, it's water managers who must continue to grapple with the nature of uncertainties and to connect these to risks appropriately. So managing that expectation is their responsibility. So these principles are part of the do's and don'ts, which is do's and don'ts of using climate change information in water planning and management, which is an effort I led several years ago, along with people from the Army Corps of Engineers and the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And was really informed by water managers to create a set of recommendations of things you should do and things you should not do when thinking about climate information. So I'm going to highlight a bit here, but Alyssa also just shared in the chat of where you can go to dig into these do's and don'ts a bit more. So next slide. So a do is first, it's important to be aware there are multiple ways to evaluate climate change. You'll hear about this more later today, but here's some quick context setting and a preview. So there's scenario studies where you chain together models and go from the global to the local scale. And that's one way of looking at it. Advance the slide. There's also stochastic hydrology, where you generate synthetic time series using statistics from the past. And this is something that's been done for decades and can be done in a way that incorporates climate change perturbations. Advance the slide. There's also paleoclimate studies where, for example, we use the width of tree rings to help generate time series and reconstruct what stream flow was like in the distant past and use that to help inform thinking about the future. Next slide. And then there's climate-informed vulnerability analysis, where we explore system vulnerabilities by doing perturbations of the system in response to changes in variables like temperature and precipitation, and then map out what these changes look like and how they might influence the decisions that would be made. And then you can use this information to inform the likelihood of changes. And then there's a bunch of other approaches that are out there, and there's a lot of innovation that's happening in this space as well. Next slide. Yeah, and others. So next slide. So another do is to understand how the decision being evaluated is important to the selection of the approach of the model or approach that you use. Again, returning back to the importance of being clear about the questions you're trying to answer before deciding what approach to take. So whether your question is about flows in April and September in the future, or whether it's about facilities being sized to prevent sewer overflows, or whether it's the magnitude, duration, and frequency of drought, or what stream temperatures are like in 20 years, like all of these questions can be approached in different ways with different tools. And therefore, articulating what you're looking for at the beginning can really help to make sure whatever you do in your evaluation is fit for purpose. Next slide. Another do is to start a climate change analysis by determining the level of detail you need according to your needs and resources. And it's important to consider practical considerations like how much will it cost, how long will it take, to what extent does the analysis improve the decision, can appropriate data and information be obtained, who's going to undertake the analysis, will it be somebody in-house or external experts, and then also how much information can you actually manage. So you don't want to go generating too much information if it's just going to lead to analysis paralysis that I mentioned earlier. Next slide. So now hopefully you have some grounding in practical considerations as we enter into the next part of our program, which I want to give you a bit of a sneak peek at. So as I talked about before, and is in our agenda, this is really oriented around the leading practices framing. So we'll first start with understand. So this includes understanding your system's vulnerabilities, risks, and opportunities. And we'll get to hear shortly from Julia and Alan with some stage setting on water management in the Delaware River Basin. Next slide. Then we'll have some additional understanding. Dan and Abby are going to tag team on a presentation that highlights climate modeling and projections for the water sector for water sector professionals. And that'll be followed by Amy sharing some insights from the Delaware River Basin Commission on addressing climate change impacts at the basin scale. Next slide. Then tomorrow, we're going to focus on planning, and we'll get to plan for multiple futures, think about planning for multiple futures and building capacity. We'll start with a game. So the game Decision Making for the Decades, which can help us think through the ways in which you make decisions in an ever-changing world. And we'll also get to hear from Joel about general planning methods and Rob from Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty methods. Next slide. Then to illustrate implement, we're going to see how people are acting to implement changes in their assets and actions. We'll get to hear case studies from across the country. We'll be hearing from Brandon, who will provide perspectives on adaptation decision-making at Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and Akeen, who is going to be sharing his experiences with dynamic adaptive policy pathways from Southern Florida Water Management District. Next slide. Then on Thursday, we're going to get to learn about how to engage, which focuses on motivating action, engaging and supporting others, and developing climate messages. Specifically, we'll hear from Trousseau about the ways in which he and the Florida Water and Climate Alliance have thought about this and connecting the work across water and climate science communities in Florida. And then we're going to hear from Ellen from NOAA, what NOAA's working on, and how they're working to engage water and climate science communities in the Northeast. Next slide. And finally, we'll be thinking about how to sustain these efforts going forward. So we hope to provide opportunities, as Alyssa said, even within this virtual setting, for you all to connect and support and sustain each other. So we've designed this to include breakout groups, a game, a panel discussion, alongside other opportunities to engage through polling and Mentimeter. So, and using a virtual whiteboard. So we really want to gain expertise, which include you. So you can flip through the next couple slides. So you, the person on your screen to your right, the person on your screen to your left, the person who's diagonal to you, and in essence, all of us. Next slide. So I'm just going to allude to the fact that one of the goals of the workshop is to connect each other. And one of the ways that we're aiming to do this is a virtual whiteboard, and we'll introduce that to you all very shortly. And we ask that you continue to use this whiteboard to share ideas throughout the workshop. And we'll be capturing takeaways, questions, gaps, and challenges. And then on day 3, we'll have the opportunity to really reflect on action items and next steps. Next slide. And finally, to pull together the different climate adaptation actions, along with the discussions and learning that we've had across the last 3 days, Heidi is going to host a panel where Franco, Mark, Howard, and Jen will reflect on what they learned throughout and thoughts on the path forward. So I'm really looking forward to learning from you. In the pre-workshop survey, as Julia mentioned, many of you already are using climate information, so you have experiences to share, and so please remember to chime in, ask questions, and share your insights. Next slide. So are you ready? Here we go, and I'll pass the mic back to Alyssa, or back maybe to Julia.
Yes, thank you, Julie. That was a great